A few minutes after 11 on December 2, 1859, John Brown walked down the steps of the Charlestown jail, climbed into the back of a horse-drawn wagon, and sat down on his own coffin. Flanked by files of soldiers, the wagon moved off toward a field a short distance from the town where a scaffold had been erected. The field was ringed by 1,500 soldiers. No civilians were permitted near the execution site. The abolitionist's last words were directed to the hangman as one final adjustment of the noose was made. "Be quick," he said. At 11:30 a hatchet stroke sprung the trap and John Brown died. But the end was not yet. True, Brown was dead, but he had helped to arouse popular passions both north and south to the point where compromise would be impossible. The raid created a national furor and generated a wave of emotionalism that widened the sectional breach that had divided the country for so many years. Although conservative Northern opinion quickly condemned the raid as the work of a madman, the more radical hailed it as the best news America ever had and glorified Brown as the new saint whose martyrdom in the cause of human freedom would make the gallows, according to Emerson, glorious like the cross. According to some, it was the original intention of Brown to seize the arsenal at Harper's Ferry on the night of the 24th of October, and to take the arms there deposited to the neighboring mountains, with a number of the wealthier citizens of the vicinity, as hostages, until they should redeem themselves by liberating an equal number of their slaves. The assumption is that Brown merely intended to attempt to carry on a guerrilla warfare from some point in the nearby mountains, and that his entrance to Harper's Ferry was not an occupation of the place but a raid upon it, undertaken for the purpose of advertising, in a spectacular way, the guerrilla warfare which he intended to engage in. That is an incorrect conclusion. Brown was not advertising his revolution when he secretly entered Harper's Ferry. These men were not baiting death for spectacular effect. They had a well-defined purpose in view, but it was not to capture a few slaveholders and release some slaves. Kagi revealed to one prisoner that their purpose was not the expatriation of one slave or 1,000 slaves, but their liberation in the states wherein they were born and were now held in bondage. In the philosophy of John Brown, what Nat Turner had done in a section of Southampton County, could, if properly promoted, be done in any other section or locality, and, if in any locality, then in every locality, or throughout the whole South. Therefore, an insurrection by the slaves, having for its object the overthrow of the existing state governments of the South, was a venture, from his point of view, which might be undertaken with reasonable prospects for success, the ultimate result depending largely upon his ability to organize the slaves effectively for revolt, to equip them for the initial uprising, and thereafter to capably direct the movement. Brown selected the place and occupied it as the base for his military operations, because he intended to use the generous supplies of war material, which were then in store there, for the equipment of the army that he planned to organize. The occupation was to be permanent. It was a stratagem of his campaign, an incident in his main design. He had before him a long line of precedents and examples which he studied, and ideals, written in blood, which he sought to emulate. If an ignorant slave, with a score of poorly armed black followers, who were also slaves, could kill 60 white people in a day, how many white people could 1,000 blacks, who are well equipped for midnight slaughter, kill in a single night? The theory of Brown's operations being the conquest of the South through an insurrection of the slaves, the collapse of the scheme was coincident with the failure of the slaves to execute the part assigned to them in the plan of the invasion. The slaves should not be blamed for this. The fault lies on the part of Brown. Nat Turner had shown his followers how to start an insurrection. He personally spilled the first blood which turned loose the carnage in Southampton County. Brown now saw, too late, that if he and his captains had each led a party of blacks, as Turner had led, and shown them how to kill, as Turner had shown his followers, they too might have turned loose the furies of which Brown dreamed, and launched the hurricane of death. Brown overlooked the weak link in the chain that unless the slaves were already in a state of agitation, there might be no response, or a feeble one. In the atmosphere of crisis that gripped the South in the wake of the raid, the small voices of moderates were lost in the din of extremists who saw Brown's act as part of a vast Northern conspiracy to instigate servile insurrections throughout the slave states. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the secessionist movement could no longer be contained. On December 20th, unable to tolerate a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery, South Carolina severed her ties with the Union. By February 7, 1861, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had formed Confederate States of America. The war that John Brown predicted would come, and which his raid helped to precipitate, began in April 1861. When it ended almost 4 years to the day later, slavery had been destroyed along with some 600,000 lives and millions of dollars worth of property. Among the casualties of the war was Harper's Ferry. The town's strategic position on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley made it a prime target for both Union and Confederate forces. It changed hands again and again, and by war's end in 1865 the place was a shambles. The appearance of ruin by war and fire was awful. Charred ruins were all that remain of the splendid public works, arsenals, workshops and railroads, stores, hotels, and dwelling houses all mingled in one common destruction. Much the same observation was made 3 years later in the summer of 1865 by John T. Trowbridge, a New England writer, during a tour of the South. The town is the reverse of agreeable. It is said to have been a pleasant and picturesque place formerly. The streets were well graded, and the hillsides above were graced with terraces and trees. But war has changed all. Freshets of water tear down the center of the streets, and the hillsides present only ragged growths of weeds. The town itself lies half in ruins. And all about the town are rubbish, filth and stench. And what of John Brown's legacy? The answer is not simple. He was a murderer and thief who used the Kansas-Missouri War for personal gain, but he was a zealous advocate for the abolition of slavery both in battle and in church. He was a true believer who was going to free the slaves no matter the cost, even if the cost was the lives and health of his children. The life of John Brown teaches us that humanity is not divided into two absolutely distinct and entirely separated portions, one good and the other evil. The good are liable to, and the bad are capable of, receiving much into their own lives and characters, that belongs to the other. This universally occurs. The great errors and the great wrongs imputable to John Brown do not forbid us to discern what was commendable in him. They may be accounted for without throwing him out of the pale of humanity or our having to shut our eyes to traits and merits other ways exhibited.
You know that, nerd?
Yeah, I don't know what you call it though.
John Brown's a hanging on to the sour apple tree is what we always call it. What do you call it?